20, three formerly enslaved people from Georgia came to a refugee camp in Brooklyn in August of 1863. On their second night there, volunteers from Germany served them hamburgers, which were simple ground beef on soft bread rolls with salt and pepper. When they took their first bites, 17 adults and 6 children started crying very hard. They were not crying from pain or sadness, but from something the volunteers had never seen before. It was the big shock of tasting food made with care, served with respect, and eaten as free people. Within 48 hours of that meal, the first person went missing. By Halloween, all 23 were gone without a sign. The police would not look into it. The camp's papers were changed, and the true story of what happened to those who wept over hamburgers was hidden under piles of legal papers, help from people in the North, and a secret plan that went from the Brooklyn docks all the way back to the plantation in Georgia. They had risked everything to leave. Before we go on with this story, I have to ask you something. If you like finding out the hidden truths of American history, the stories that school books leave out, then please subscribe to this channel and press the notification bell. Also, I am wondering, where are you listening from right now? Write your state or city in the comments. Now, let us go back to that summer of 1863, when 23 people found out that even in the North, freedom was easier to break than they ever thought. The summer of 1863 had turned New York into a boiling pot. The riots about the draft in July had left parts of Manhattan burned, and many black New Yorkers were killed by angry crowds upset about army laws. Federal soldiers brought peace back, but hate was still there just under the surface. Across the river, Brooklyn was quieter, but tension ran through every neighborhood like electricity looking for a place to ground. On the eastern shore of Wallabout Bay, where prisoners from the Revolutionary War once died on British ships, the Brooklyn Abolition Society ran a refugee camp in an old rope factory. Harold Grayson, a rich shipping businessman who had lost his son at the Battle of Antietam, paid for the place. By late August, almost 140 formerly enslaved people were staying there, sleeping in old barracks, learning to read, and looking for jobs in a city that offered freedom but not much welcome. August 27th brought new people, 23 of them who traveled together from Georgia. They moved like one group, watching out for each other, led by a woman the others called Patience. She looked like she was about 35 years old, tall and thin, with graying hair wrapped in old red cloth. When Harold Grayson talked to her for the camp list, she gave very little information. She said they escaped from Pritchard's Landing, a rice plantation north of Savannah. The trip took 7 months. They started with 31 people. 8 did not make it. The volunteers saw right away that this group was different from other refugees. Most came alone or in small families, strangers connected only by what happened to them. But these 23 acted like a family, sharing everything, sleeping in bunks next to each other, and speaking among themselves in a gullah way that showed they were from the low country. The children were very quiet. 3 boys and 3 girls, including a baby named Hope. None of them played with other kids in the camp. They watched everything with old eyes. Among the volunteers at the camp was Friedrich Vogel, a young German butcher whose family ran away from Prussia after the failed revolutions of 1848. Friedrich worked in his uncle's shop during the day and spent evenings at the camp teaching English and helping cook meals. 2 days after the Georgia group arrived, he had an idea for something special. Hamburgers, a dish from the German working class that was getting popular in immigrant neighborhoods in New York. It was ground beef mixed with onions and spices, fried and served on soft rolls. Simple food, but filling. Harold Grayson said yes to the cost right away. They started making the food in the middle of the afternoon on August 29th. Friedrich and other volunteers worked at the outside kitchen, turning meat grinders by hand, chopping onions, and mixing spices. The beef cooked loud and hot on metal pans, sending up a good smell that drifted across the grounds. Refugees came out of their barracks following the smell. Volunteers set up long tables in the yard, the same tables used for every group meal. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was the rich smell, maybe the nice weather, or maybe something in the air itself, hinting that after so much darkness, a moment of simple happiness was possible. As the sunset turned the Manhattan skyline orange and gold, the people in the camp lined up with metal plates. Friedrich served each person himself, putting a hamburger on a warm roll. Some younger volunteers brought extras like sliced tomatoes, pickled cucumbers, and even yellow mustard. It was a feast compared to normal camp food. Patience's group came to the line last, as if making sure everyone else ate first. They walked past Friedrich one by one, taking their plates with quiet thanks. The volunteers noticed many were shaking as they took their food. Anna Miller, a German woman helping serve, whispered to Friedrich that they looked afraid the food would vanish. The refugees went back to their normal spot near the eastern barracks. For a long time, nobody ate. They just held their plates, looking at the food. Then Patience lifted her hamburger with both hands and breathed in deeply. Others did the same. An older man named Solomon closed his eyes as he smelled it. A woman named Esther put her hand to her mouth. When Patience finally took a bite, her face changed. Her eyes got wide. She chewed slowly on purpose, as if trying to remember every feeling. Then her face broke and tears started running down her cheeks. Within seconds, others were crying too, not quiet tears, but loud, heavy sobs. Young Benjamin took a bite and started wailing, not from pain, but from something that looked like joy mixed with terrible sadness. A young woman named Naomi held the baby Hope while pressing her hamburger to her forehead, crying so hard she could barely breathe. The crying spread through the whole group. Even the tough Solomon let tears run into his gray beard as he ate. They cried and ate at the same time, unable to stop doing either. Some laughed through their tears. Others rocked back and forth like they were praying. The strength of their feelings was shocking, almost scary in how raw it was. Friedrich and the other volunteers stood still, not sure if they should go near them or give them space. Anna's own eyes filled with tears of sympathy. Thomas Rutherford, a free black volunteer whose parents had escaped slavery in Virginia, watched with deep understanding. He knew what this moment meant, not just food, but seeing their humanity, the simple dignity of a warm meal, seasoned right, served with kindness. After several minutes, the crying slowly stopped. Patience wiped her eyes and looked at her friends, saying something in Gullah that the volunteers could not understand, but the tone said it was okay to feel what they were feeling. They pulled themselves together enough to keep eating, though tears kept falling down many faces. When they finished, Patience walked up to Friedrich. Her face was still wet, her eyes red and puffy. She took his hand in both of hers. She told him in careful English that they never knew food could taste like that, like they were people who deserved it. Friedrich, who had run away from bad government himself, nodded without speaking. He understood. That night, the camp went back to its normal routine. Volunteers cleaned up and covered the cooking fire. Refugees got ready for sleep. Patience's group stayed together, sitting in a tight circle and speaking quietly. Harold Grayson, doing his evening walk, stopped to watch them. He later wrote in the camp book that the Georgia group showed great emotion that evening and seemed very close and protective of each other. What Grayson did not write, and what maybe he did not see, was the man watching from the shadows away from the lamps. A white man in a dark coat, standing still near the trees. He had been there for over an hour, watching the food being served, watching Patience's group, especially when the lights finally went down. He turned and walked toward the road leading to the ferry docks. If anyone had followed him, they would have seen him meet two other men near the water. The three spoke for a short time, then split up into the night. 41 hours later, 7-year-old Ruth disappeared. August 31st started humid and heavy. Ruth had been told to help with laundry, a nice job putting wet clothes on lines between posts. Anna Mueller was in charge, teaching the children simple songs while they worked. Ruth was quiet but paid attention, carefully pinning each piece of clothing. Around the middle of the morning, Anna stepped away for a moment to get more clothespins. When she came back less than 3 minutes later, Ruth was gone. The laundry area was open on all sides, easy to see from many spots. Anna called Ruth's name, thinking the girl had walked toward the bathroom, but Ruth did not show up. Anna checked the likely places, then started asking other refugees. No one had seen her. The girl had vanished in broad daylight from the middle of a busy camp. By noon, Harold Grayson set up a full search. They looked through barracks, checked the rocky shore, searched nearby woods and swamps. They called Ruth's name until their voices got tired. Nothing. The girl had disappeared like morning fog. Patience, when told, went very still. Her face became a mask showing nothing. She asked one question. Did anyone see a white man watching? Grayson promised her that volunteers were always there and no strangers entered the camp. Patience nodded slowly but said no more. She went back to her group and spoke in fast, quiet Gullah. The others reacted just like her, with a terrible stillness, as if they had been waiting for this. Friedrich went to the local police station to report the missing child. He came back 2 hours later, his face red with anger and shame. The desk officer had barely looked up. He said a black girl from the contraband camp probably ran off because they do that. When Friedrich insisted that a 7-year-old would not just run away, the officer shrugged. He said they did not have men to waste searching for runaways. He refused to write a report. The camp stayed on high alert for 3 days with volunteers taking turns watching through the night, but life could not just stop. Slowly, the extra watching relaxed. Ruth's absence became a painful mystery, mourned but unexplained. Patience's group, however, never relaxed. They moved in tight bunches now, never letting anyone be alone. The men took turns staying awake through the night like guards. When volunteers asked about this, Patience gave vague reasons about feeling unsafe. Thomas Rutherford understood what she was not saying directly. Slave catchers, bounty hunters, kidnappers who made a game of capturing escaped slaves even in northern cities. The fugitive slave law was still the rule for the whole country. On September 4th, Caleb disappeared. He was one of the older members, maybe 40, with a bad limp from an old injury. He had been helping unload supply wagons. It was hard work with many breaks. During one break, Caleb walked toward the trees, likely to use the bathroom. 5 minutes later, when the break ended, Caleb did not come back. Friedrich walked to the trees calling his name. He found nothing, no sign of a fight, no sign of which way he went. This time, Grayson did not bother with the police. Instead, he sent volunteers to search docks and nearby neighborhoods, asking at bars if anyone had seen a limping black man. The searches found nothing. Caleb had disappeared just as completely as Ruth. The pattern kept happening with scary regularity. Every few days, another member of Patience's group would vanish, sometimes during the day while doing normal work, other times someone there at the evening meal would be gone by morning, their bed untouched as if they never lay down. Men, women, even young Isaac, who was picking up firewood one moment and gone the next. By the middle of September, the camp's mood had changed from worried to fearful. Other refugees started avoiding Patience's group, as if bad luck might catch on. Some whispered about curses. Others suggested real reasons, like slave hunters catching them one by one. But how could it happen so well, so cleanly without witnesses? Patience had aged clearly. Her face got thin. Her eyes looked haunted. The remaining members, now fewer than 15, stayed within sight of each other every moment they were awake. They stopped joining camp activities and stopped going to meals. Volunteers brought food to their barracks, and Patience took it with hollow thanks. Thomas Rutherford decided to look into it himself. As a free black man with friends throughout Brooklyn's black community, he had ways to get information that white volunteers lacked. He began asking questions at Bridge Street churches and at docks where black workers loaded ships. Had anyone seen suspicious white men watching the camp? Were there rumors of slave catchers working in the area? The answers were disturbing but not specific. Yes, there were always bounty hunters in New York, especially after the riots. Yes, people had vanished before. Free black New Yorkers snatched off streets and never seen again. But no one could say exactly who was doing this or where victims were taken. On September 21st, nearly a month after they arrived, Naomi vanished during the night. The baby Hope was found in the morning, still sleeping in Naomi's bunk, wrapped carefully in a blanket. But Naomi herself was gone. The baby being there seemed done on purpose, proof that Naomi had not left because she wanted to. A mother would never leave her baby by choice. This disappearance broke something in Patience. She gathered the members left, now just 11 adults and 2 children, and told Harold Grayson they were leaving. He argued, saying they were safer here than walking the city. Patience looked at him with eyes that saw through every comfortable lie. She said quietly that they were not safe anywhere, but at least out there, they could see them coming. Before Patience could act, Thomas got a visit from Abraham Fletcher, a black dock worker who worked the ferry docks. Fletcher had heard Thomas was asking questions about disappearances. He said he had information, but it was dangerous information. The 2 men met after dark in Fletcher's small room above a warehouse by the water. Fletcher poured whiskey into chipped cups and told Thomas what he had seen. For the past month, 3 white men had been coming to the docks regularly. They dressed nicely with good coats and clean boots, but something about them bothered Fletcher. They paid attention to who came and went, especially black people traveling alone or in small groups. Fletcher had watched them write down arrivals and departures in small leather books, like merchants counting stock. Fletcher leaned forward and said what made his blood cold was seeing them take people. He said it was not rough or violent. They just walked up to someone waiting for the ferry, spoke to them quietly, and then that person went with them, peaceful as could be. He watched it happen 3 times. He had never seen any of those people again. Thomas asked the obvious question, how do they get people to go? Fletcher's face got dark. He said they show them papers, documents with seals and such. The same kind slave hunters use claiming someone is a runaway. Got a legal right to be returned to their owner. Most black folks see those papers and go along peacefully because they know causing a scene just makes it worse. Might get beaten, might get killed right there. And the law will not help. Thomas asked if he knew where they took people. Fletcher shook his head. He said they usually had a wagon waiting on South Street, a covered freight wagon. They load people inside and drive off toward the ferry. He guessed Manhattan but did not know past that. He paused, but he heard something else. There is a man up in Manhattan who runs a boarding house near 5 Points. His name is Dutton, Virgil Dutton. Word is he has connections down south, helps with returns for bounty hunters, provides a holding place before they ship people back to their owners. Thomas thanked Fletcher and left, his mind racing. He went straight to Harold Grayson's house and told him what he learned. Grayson listened with growing horror, then made a choice. He would go to federal authorities himself, not local police, but the military. The army still kept order in New York after the riots, and Grayson had friends there. If these men were running a kidnapping ring under the cover of the fugitive slave law, federal authorities needed to know. But even as Grayson planned his next move, things at the camp were reaching a breaking point. What Thomas and Fletcher did not know was that the secret plan went far deeper than bounty hunters and bad boarding house owners. The morning after Thomas talked with Fletcher, Patience made a surprise request. She asked Harold Grayson for a private meeting, just the two of them. They met in the camp's small office, a corner of the rope factory. Patience sat down across from Grayson and was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her polished English had slipped into something raw. She told Mr. Grayson she needed to tell him the truth about who they were and why they were being taken. Grayson leaned forward and said he was listening. Patience said when she told him they came from Pritchard's Landing, that was true, but she did not tell him everything. Patience's eyes looked at something far away. She said Pritchard's Landing was not just a rice plantation. It was a breeding farm. The word made Grayson flinch. In the Deep South, especially where bringing in slaves from other countries had been against the law since 1808, some plantations had changed their business. Instead of working enslaved people just for crops, they focused on producing the next generation to be sold to growing cotton plantations. Children were the cash crop. Patience continued, her voice steady but hollow, saying all 23 of them were born at Pritchard's and grew up there. They all had value in the account books because of who their parents were, how they looked, whether they were strong or smart enough for housework or skilled jobs. Master Pritchard kept detailed records. When they escaped, they did not just steal themselves, they stole his property he had contracts to sell. Grayson said she was in New York and she was free. Even the fugitive slave law shouldn't matter this much. Patience cut him off with a bitter laugh. She said the law doesn't protect people who look like her, and he knew that, but it was worse than just slave catchers. She leaned forward, staring at him. She said before they left Pritchard's, they found papers in the master's office. They couldn't read most of it, but Solomon could read some, enough to understand. Pritchard had agreements with men up north, businessmen, investors. They gave money for his breeding operation, and in return, they got a share when the stock was sold. The meaning made Grayson feel sick. He asked if she was saying northern businessmen invested in slavery. She said invested in them specifically by name, by age, by value. Those papers had names on them. New York names, Boston names. She paused, fear showing through her calm. One was from Brooklyn. They couldn't read the full name clearly. Solomon said the first part looked like Gray or Grav something. They thought maybe it was a mistake, but then they got here to his camp, and he was so kind and they wanted to believe. She shook her head. But then Ruth vanished and Caleb and all the others, and she started thinking, what if it wasn't an accident that they ended up here? What if someone guided them here, made sure they came to this specific camp? Grayson said that was crazy, but his voice was weak. His mind raced through the dates. He opened the camp in June. Patience's group escaped in January and arrived in August. 7 months on the road, and somehow they ended up at Wallabout Bay rather than any of the other refugee places. He had always assumed it was random chance, but what if? He asked who else knew about these papers. She said the master's overseer Samuel Cogburn. He handled the business side contracts and sales, and if he knew, then anyone he worked with would know too. Patience's hands tightened in her lap. She told Mr. Grayson she wasn't saying he was involved. She didn't believe he was, but somebody connected to this camp was. Somebody had been telling those men when they were alone, what work they were assigned to, where they would be weak. How else could they take them so cleanly one by one without anyone seeing? Grayson wanted to reject her idea entirely, but he couldn't. The disappearances had been too smooth, too targeted, and there was another disturbing detail. Of all the refugees who had passed through the camp that summer, only Patience's group had these vanishings. Other people came and went freely. It was only the 23 from Pritchard's Landing who were being erased one by one. Grayson said slowly if what she was saying was true, then someone would need access to camp records to know who was there and when they arrived. They would need freedom to move in and out without attracting attention. He paused. He said that describes every volunteer. Patience said bluntly that it also describes him, which is why she was taking a risk telling him this. But she was out of choices. In 3, maybe 4 days, there wouldn't be enough of them left to tell the story. So she was betting her life, all their lives, that he was who he pretended to be. Before Grayson could answer, a knock sounded. Friedrich entered looking worried. He told Mr. Grayson there was a man to see him. Said he was from the Freedmen's Bureau, needed to speak about camp registration rules. Grayson and Patience exchanged a heavy look. The Freedmen's Bureau wouldn't exist until after the war ended. Whoever this man was, he wasn't a federal official. Grayson told Friedrich to tell him he would be out shortly. Friedrich nodded and left. Patience stood up. She said that is one of them. She would bet everything she owned. She moved toward the door, then paused. She told Mr. Grayson if he was the man she hoped he was, then he needed to act now because tonight they were going to try to take the rest of them. She could feel it. After Patience left, Grayson sat alone trying to organize his thoughts. Could there be truth in her accusations? He reviewed his business dealings, his partners, his investments. He had made his money in shipping, real shipping of goods, not human beings, but he knew many of his fellow merchants had less honest backgrounds. The connections between northern money and southern slavery ran deep and dark, but actual investment in a breeding farm that went beyond involvement into active participation, could someone in Brooklyn really be involved? And if so, how had they learned that Pritchard's property had escaped north? Unless the person had been at Pritchard's Landing themselves, or had direct contact with Cogburn, the overseer. Unless the entire refugee camp had been established not as charity, but as a trap, a comfortable cage designed to lure escaped slaves into false safety before sending them back south. No, that was paranoid. He had established this camp to help people, and it had helped hundreds, but that didn't mean it couldn't also serve a darker purpose for someone else. A wolf could hide among shepherds. He walked out to meet the mystery visitor, already making a plan. He would listen to what this bureau official wanted, play along, give no sign he suspected anything. Meanwhile, he would send Thomas to find real federal authorities, military commanders who could step in with force if needed. The man waiting in the yard was plain, mid-40s, thinning brown hair, dark suit that was old. He introduced himself as Charles Wexler, assistant to the regional coordinator for refugee affairs. His papers looked real official documents with stamps and signatures. But Grayson had enough experience with fraud to recognize good fakes. Wexler explained that he needed to count all camp residents, checking names and previous homes to ensure no one was claiming free status falsely. Routine matter, he said, required by new federal rules. He would need access to the camp list and a chance to interview residents one by one. Grayson agreed to everything, staying pleasant and helpful while his mind worked through what this meant. This was it, the way they had been finding and targeting Patience's group. As Wexler settled into the office to begin his count, Grayson quietly pulled Thomas aside and gave urgent orders. Go to Manhattan right away. Find the federal marshal or provost marshal, someone with real power and troops. Bring them back to Wall, about Bay tonight. Don't trust local police. Tell them there is a kidnapping ring happening and lives are at stake." Thomas left immediately, catching the next ferry. But even as he left, the situation was getting worse in ways no one had guessed because Charles Wexler hadn't come alone. While Wexler distracted Grayson and the volunteers with paperwork, two other men had quietly placed themselves near the camp's edge. They weren't hiding exactly, just staying out of direct sight, waiting for their chance. That chance came at twilight during the evening meal, when attention was on food and talking. One of the men approached the barracks where Patience's remaining group had isolated themselves. He knocked politely on the door frame and called out in a friendly voice, saying he had a letter for someone named Patience Crane, came from Georgia, said it was urgent family business. Inside the barracks, the remaining 11 adults and 2 children froze. A letter from Georgia could only mean one thing. Someone from Pritchard's Landing had found them, but it could also be a trap. Patience looked at Solomon standing nearest the door. The old man's eyes were hard as stone. He whispered not to do it, that there was no letter, but then the man's voice came again with an edge. He said he also had a message about a girl named Ruth, said she was alive and waiting, said she wanted her people to come get her. That changed everything. Ruth, who had vanished a month ago, if there was even a chance she was alive, they couldn't ignore it. Patience moved toward the door, but Solomon grabbed her arm. He said it was a lie. Had to be. Patience said quietly, maybe, but if there was any chance, she pulled free and approached the door. Through the gap between boards, she could see the man's shape holding what looked like an envelope. She opened the door just enough to speak through the gap. She asked to see the letter. The man stepped closer, and in the last rays of sunlight, Patience got a clear look at his face. It was a face she recognized, not from the camp, but from farther back, from Georgia, from Pritchard's Landing itself. This man had been there, had stood in the yard during inspections, had watched them with judging eyes, as if calculating their worth. Patience breathed out "you," and tried to slam the door, but the man was faster. He wedged his boot in the gap and threw his weight against the door. Patience and Solomon pushed back, but they were weak from weeks of stress and fear. The door flew open, knocking them backward. The man didn't enter immediately. Instead, he stepped aside, and 2 more figures appeared. One was Charles Wexler. The other was someone Patience had never seen, a tall man with silver, gray hair and the look of power. He looked at the huddled refugees with hate mixed with math. He said in a fancy accent that they could do this the easy way or the hard way. Either they come peacefully, get moved to a safe place, and this whole misunderstanding gets fixed through proper legal channels, or... He let the threat hang. Solomon, still on the floor, looked up with defiance. He said they had no legal right to them. They were free people on free soil. The gray-haired man smiled without warmth. He said according to the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, any person claimed as a fugitive slave can be arrested without a warrant and returned to the claimant upon proof of ownership. He said he had papers from Mr. Thaddeus Pritchard of Pritchard's Landing, Georgia, identifying each of them as his legal property. He had warrants signed by a federal commissioner allowing their arrest and return, and he had power under federal law to use whatever force is necessary. He pulled papers from his coat, official-looking documents covered in seals and signatures. So yes, he did have the legal right now. He asked if they were coming peacefully. For a long moment, no one moved. Then one of the younger men, Daniel, did something unexpected. He started laughing. A wild, desperate sound. He gasped, "Legal right." He said they got the legal right to steal them, drag them back, work them to death, but they got no legal right to be free. He said, "That's America." His laughter died and his face hardened. He said he wasn't going back. If they wanted him, they would have to kill him right there. Solomon nodded. Same. He lived 64 years, most of them in chains. He would die free or not at all. One by one, the others agreed. They would not go peacefully. The gray-haired man sighed as if dealing with stubborn children. He motioned to his companions, and the three men stepped into the barracks. What happened next happened with brutal speed. The men weren't there to kill. Dead bodies had no value, but they were skilled in stopping resistance. They carried wooden clubs and rope, and they moved with practiced teamwork. The fight lasted perhaps 2 minutes. The refugees had no weapons, were outnumbered, and tired from weeks of fear. Several tried to run out the back, only to find 2 more men waiting outside. Benjamin, one of the young boys, darted between an attacker's legs and ran toward the main yard, screaming for help. Solomon fought with great anger, using a wooden stool until someone hit him from behind. He went down hard, blood coming from his head. Daniel got his hands around one attacker's throat before being beaten until he passed out. Patience fought like something wild, clawing and biting until someone grabbed her arms and pulled them behind her back. Rope cut into her wrists. Through it all, the gray-haired man stood in the doorway, watching without expression. When the fighting stopped and all the adults lay bound on the floor, he stepped carefully over them and crouched beside Patience. He said quietly, almost friendly, that his name was Lawrence Graverson. His family had financial interests in several farms in Georgia. She and her friends represented a big money investment, capital that walked away without permission. He was simply there to get back his property, nothing personal. Patience spat in his face. Graverson wiped it away without anger, then stood and spoke to his men. He told them to load them into the wagon, use the canvas covering, and do it quietly. But Benjamin had already raised the alarm. The 10-year-old had made it to the main yard where Friedrich was helping with meal prep. He had crashed into Friedrich, sobbing and screaming that men were taking everyone. Friedrich didn't wait. He grabbed the iron poker from the cooking fire and ran toward the eastern barracks, shouting for others to follow. What Friedrich found when he burst through the door would haunt him. 11 people tied up like animals, several bleeding, being dragged toward a covered wagon backed up to the building's rear. The men turned at his arrival, expressions cold and professional. One pulled out a pistol. He told Friedrich this didn't concern him. Federal business authorized by law. If he interfered, he was blocking justice. Friedrich looked past him at Patience, at Solomon's unconscious form, at the others being loaded like cargo. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, but the man had papers, documents, federal power. Friedrich was an immigrant with no power, no standing. The smart thing would be to step aside. But Friedrich had fled Prussia exactly because he had learned that systems could be corrupt, that laws could be unfair, that standing aside while evil worked under legal power was itself evil. He raised the fire poker. He said he didn't care what papers they had, they were not taking them. The gun swung toward him. Friedrich saw the man's finger tighten on the trigger, saw Patience's eyes go wide with horror, saw his own death coming. And then Thomas Rutherford crashed through the door behind him, followed by 4 soldiers in Union blue. Thomas shouted for nobody to move. He had found a Union Army patrol in Manhattan, convinced the lieutenant that a crime was happening, and raced back with military backup. The soldiers, who had been dealing with civil unrest for weeks, didn't hesitate when they saw armed men threatening civilians. They drew their own weapons, and suddenly the power balance had shifted. Graverson looked at the new situation with calculating eyes. His men were outnumbered, facing military power. He could press his legal claims, show his warrants, and possibly still win. The law was on his side, but military officers during wartime had a lot of choice. If these soldiers decided to hold everyone for questioning, if they brought in marshals to investigate, if this turned into a public event, Graverson made his decision. He spoke to the soldiers, his voice perfectly calm, saying there had been a misunderstanding. He said they had legal authority to recover fugitive slaves, but perhaps this wasn't the right place. They would withdraw for now and pursue this through proper channels. He motioned to his men, who reluctantly let go of their captives and stepped back from the wagon. The Union lieutenant, a young man from Connecticut named William H. Schricks, who had seen slavery's ugliness at Gettysburg, looked at Graverson with open disgust. He gave him 5 minutes to get off the property. After that, he would start arresting people for assault, and he would be filing a report with his commanding officer. He said if they wanted to press legal claims, they'd do it through official channels in daylight, not with clubs and ropes in the dark. Graverson nodded shortly, then met Patience's eyes one last time. Without a word, he promised this wasn't over. Then he and his men withdrew, disappearing into the September night. The soldiers helped untie the captives and gave basic medical help. Friedrich sent for Anna and other volunteers who brought water and bandages and comfort. But even as the immediate crisis passed, everyone understood this was merely a pause, not a victory. Graverson had the law on his side. He had documents, warrants, power. He could return anytime with more men, more legal force. Harold Grayson, who had been stuck talking with Wexler during the attack, now understood the full size of what he had unknowingly helped happen. His camp, his charity, had been used as a hunting ground. But one question still burned. Who had told them? Who had been feeding information about the refugees' movements, their work assignments, their weak spots? Someone had betrayed them, and that someone was still there. Lieutenant H. Schricks proved to be more than a temporary savior. Rather than simply filing a report and moving on, he took personal interest in the case. He had lost friends at Gettysburg, and the sight of men using federal law to kidnap people who had risked everything for freedom angered him deeply. He spent the following day interviewing everyone at the camp, taking detailed statements, checking what he could learn about Graverson and his operation. The problem, H. Schricks explained to Grayson, Patience, and Thomas during an afternoon meeting, is that the law doesn't care whether slavery is morally wrong. The fugitive slave law says someone who escapes slavery can be returned to their owner if that owner can prove their claim. These documents, if real, do exactly that. Friedrich protested that they were in New York and slavery was illegal there. H. Schricks said in New York, yes, but not under federal law. The law overrides state law, one of the deals that held the Union together before the war. The North agreed to return escaped slaves to the South. Horrible, unfair, but legal. He paused. However, there are rules. Warrants must be properly issued. IDs must be checked, and force cannot be used without proper permission and oversight. What happened last night was legally questionable at best. Patience asked quietly if he could protect them. H. Schricks hesitated. He said he could put guards there for a short time, but he couldn't provide safety forever. His unit would be moved soon, and truthfully, if Graverson returns with proper federal marshals and correctly issued warrants, he wouldn't be able to stop him legally. The best he could do is ensure due process is followed, that they have a chance to fight the claims in court. Solomon, his head bandaged from the blow the night before, asked how they could fight them. They had no money for lawyers. They had no papers proving they were born free. All they had was their word against documents that say they are property. H. Schricks had no answer to that. The law was clear and it was terrible. But while H. Schricks couldn't provide lasting legal protection, he could investigate. And what he found out over the next 2 days painted a disturbing picture of how deep the secret plan ran. Working with Thomas's contacts in the black community and Friedrich's connections among German immigrants, H. Schricks pieced together the network. Graverson was indeed a businessman with big holdings in Georgia, including part ownership in Pritchard's Landing. But he wasn't the only northern investor. At least 5 other men, merchants, bankers, and factory owners from New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, had provided money for the breeding operation in exchange for shares of future sales. It was, basically, a futures market in human beings. They had invested in people before they were born, betting on their future value when sold south. When Patience's group escaped, they represented a big financial loss. But more than that, they represented risk. If they talked about the northern investment, if they revealed names and amounts, it could destroy reputations and potentially lead to criminal charges. Even in 1863, even with the fugitive slave law providing legal cover, there were lines of involvement that Northern society found difficult to stomach publicly. So Graverson had mounted a recovery operation, but also a silencing operation. The people who had been taken from the camp hadn't all been returned to Pritchard's Landing. Some had simply disappeared. Ricks discovered through his investigation that at least 3 of the missing refugees had been seen briefly at Dutton's boarding house in 5 Points, and then never seen again. Dutton, when questioned by military authorities, claimed they had been picked up by their legal owners and transported south, but he had no documents, no records, no proof. What Ricks suspected but couldn't prove was darker. Some of the refugees had been killed, murdered quietly, bodies disposed of in the East River, or buried in unmarked graves because dead people couldn't testify. Dead people couldn't name names or describe the northern businessmen who had profited from their enslavement. But the question that haunted everyone was, how had Graverson known exactly when Patience's group would arrive at Wallabout Bay? How had he known their work assignments, their movements, their weak spots? There had to be a spy inside the camp, someone who had been feeding information from the beginning. Grayson conducted his own quiet investigation among the volunteers. He interviewed each one separately, asking about their backgrounds, their connections, their activities over the past months. Most were exactly what they appeared to be, good-hearted people trying to help. But one volunteer's story didn't quite add up. Shaw O'Brien, an Irish immigrant who had been volunteering since the camp opened in June, had told everyone he was a dock worker from Red Hook who supported the Union cause. But when Grayson made quiet checks, no one at the Red Hook docks knew anyone by that name. The address O'Brien had provided didn't exist, and when Grayson reviewed the camp's records, he noticed something disturbing. O'Brien always seemed to volunteer for tasks that put him in close contact with new arrivals. Always asked detailed questions about where people had come from and where they were going. Grayson shared his suspicions with Ricks, who arranged for military police to quietly arrest O'Brien for questioning. What they discovered confirmed their worst fears. Sean O'Brien wasn't his real name. It was Shaw Toiver, and he worked for a private investigation firm that specialized in locating fugitive slaves and runaway debtors. He had been placed at the camp specifically to identify valuable fugitives who might pass through. Under questioning by military authorities, Toiver admitted he had been hired by someone connected to Pritchard's Landing to watch for any refugees from that specific plantation. When Patience's group arrived, he had sent word immediately. He had then provided regular updates about their schedules, their habits, their movements. He had created the opportunities for the kidnappings by suggesting work assignments that isolated individuals. But Toiver insisted he hadn't known the full size of what was happening. He thought he was simply helping return legal property to its rightful owner, operating within the bounds of the fugitive slave law. He claimed he had no knowledge of any plans to harm the refugees, no awareness of the Northern investment scheme, no understanding that this was about silencing witnesses rather than simply recovering assets. Whether Toiver's claims of ignorance were true or convenient, the damage was done. The camp had been compromised from the beginning. Every refugee who had passed through had been listed, assessed, and potentially marked for recapture. The place that should have been a safe haven had been a trap. When Grayson learned the truth, something broke inside him. He had built this camp with real intentions, funded it with his own money, dedicated himself to the cause of helping formerly enslaved people build new lives, and it had all been used against them. His charity had become a weapon. He gathered the camp's residents and volunteers that evening and confessed everything: Toiver's betrayal, Graverson's network, the Northern investment scheme, his own accidental involvement. His voice cracked as he spoke. He said he thought he was doing good. He thought he was helping, but he made them vulnerable. He put them in danger, and for that he was deeply sorry. Patience, sitting in the front row with her remaining people, listened without expression. When Grayson finished, she stood. She told Mr. Grayson he didn't betray them. The law betrayed them. The country betrayed them. He just learned what they knew all along, that in America, even kindness can be turned into a weapon against black folks. Even safety is a fake idea. She looked around at the gathered refugees and volunteers. She said they appreciated that hamburger. They appreciated the tears they cried when they tasted it. Because for one moment, just one moment, they felt like people deserved to be treated with dignity. And nobody can take that moment away from them. Not Graverson, not the law, not the whole country. Her words hung in the air, a mix of grief and defiance that captured something essential about survival under impossible conditions. You took the moments of grace when you could find them, knowing they might be short, knowing the horror might return, but you took them anyway because the other choice was to give up entirely. Lieutenant H. Ricks gave Grayson and the camp residents 48 hours to make decisions. Graverson would almost certainly return with proper federal marshals and perfect papers. When that happened, H. Ricks would have no legal grounds to intervene. Patience's remaining group, now down to 9 adults and 2 children after all the disappearances, needed to move, and they needed to move fast. But where could they go? Canada was the obvious answer. Across the border into a nation that had ended slavery and didn't recognize the fugitive slave law. But that meant a journey of hundreds of miles through dangerous land with limited resources and federal law actively working against them. Other northern cities offered no more protection than New York. Even in Massachusetts, even in Boston, slave catchers operated with legal freedom. Thomas Rutherford proposed a different idea. He had contacts in the abolitionist community who operated a network of safe houses. The Underground Railroad's northern end designed not just to help people escape the South, but to help them disappear once they reached the North. New names, fake papers, placement with families and communities who would protect their secrets. It was risky, illegal, and far from perfect, but it was a chance. Grayson committed his remaining resources to the effort. He would personally pay for the journey, provide whatever money, supplies, and connections he could access. It was the least he could do after his camp had been used as a trap. He sold assets, called in favors, and within 24 hours had gathered enough resources to give Patience's group a fighting chance. But there was a problem. Baby Hope, the infant who had lost her mother Naomi, couldn't make a difficult journey through hostile territory. She needed stability, safety, consistent care, and she needed it in a way that wouldn't mark her as a fugitive. After much painful discussion, Patience made a decision that tore at her heart. Hope would be placed with a free black family in Brooklyn, people with legal standing who could raise her as their own daughter. It was the only way to give the child a chance at a normal life. The parting between Patience and Hope was nearly impossible to watch. Patience had carried this child across 7 states, had protected her when her mother vanished, had promised to keep her safe. Now she was handing her to strangers, but as Patience pressed her forehead against Hope's tiny head, she whispered that she was going to grow up free. She was going to grow up safe. She was going to grow up knowing she was a person who deserves good things. That was all they ever wanted. That was all any of them ever wanted. On October 1st, as autumn began settling over New York, Patience's remaining group prepared to leave Wallabout Bay. They would travel at night, moving through the Underground Railroad network, heading finally toward Canada. It would take weeks, maybe months. Some of them might not make it, but staying meant certain capture and return to Georgia, or worse. Harold Grayson personally saw them off, shaking hands with each person, offering quiet words of encouragement and apology. When he reached Patience, he tried to speak, but found himself unable to form words. She held his hand in both of hers. She said he tried. That counts for something. They left just after midnight on October 2nd, disappearing into the darkness like ghosts. Friedrich and Anna stood watching long after they had vanished from sight. Thomas Rutherford had gone with them. He had decided that helping them reach safety was more important than his own comfort in Brooklyn. His knowledge of the routes and his connections in the black community might make the difference between survival and capture. The camp at Wallabout Bay continued operating for another 3 months before Grayson finally closed it down. The news of Toiver's betrayal had destroyed trust in the place. Other refugee camps in the city began receiving the formerly enslaved people who needed shelter. Grayson himself became more actively involved in abolitionist circles, using his wealth and connections to support more secret operations, the kind that didn't announce themselves or keep detailed records that could be used against them. Lawrence Graverson made one more attempt to recover his property. He returned to Wallabout Bay with federal marshals and proper papers on October 5th, 3 days after Patience's group had fled. When he found them gone, he was reportedly furious. He demanded that Grayson reveal where they had gone, threatened legal action, accused him of plotting to break federal law. Grayson, with Lieutenant H. Ricks standing beside him, calmly replied that he had no idea where the refugees had gone. People came and left the camp of their own free will. He kept no records of their departures or destinations. Graverson knew he was lying, but there was nothing he could do. His property had escaped and the trail had gone cold. His financial investment was lost, and more importantly, from his view, the witnesses who could have exposed the Northern investment scheme were scattered and unreachable. The question of what happened to the people who had been taken before Patience's group fled was never fully answered. Some may have been returned to Georgia, sold back into slavery in violation of every moral principle. Others likely met darker fates, disappeared to protect the secret plan. Their bodies never recovered. Their names never recorded. Ruth, young Caleb, Naomi, and the others joined the countless thousands who simply vanished into the machinery of America's original sin. Their stories lost to history. As for Patience Crane and her remaining companions, the historical record goes silent. There are no documents tracking their movement north, no records of their arrival in Canada. This is on purpose. The Underground Railroad left few traces exactly to protect the people it helped, but there are hints, suggestions, pieces that perhaps tell the rest of the story. In the spring of 1864, a group of black refugees arrived in St. Catharines, Ontario, just across the border from Niagara Falls. They were led by a woman described in a church book only as P. They settled in the community, found work, began building lives. One of the men in the group, an elder described as having seen much suffering, helped establish a school for refugee children. He was known to the community simply as Solomon. It is not proof, it is barely evidence, but it is enough to hope. The hamburger Patience and her companions tasted on August 29, 1008. 163 represented something more than food. It represented a moment of recognition, an acknowledgement that they were human beings deserving of dignity, care, and simple pleasure. The tears they cried were not just thanks, but grief for all the years when such recognition had been denied. They were tears for every meal they had eaten from troughs like animals, for every scrap they had fought over, for every empty belly that had defined their existence under slavery. That moment of joy made what came after even more devastating, because it revealed the cruelty at the heart of the system they tried to escape. That even in freedom, even in the North, even surrounded by people who claimed to oppose slavery, they were still seen mainly as property to be recovered or threats to be removed. The fugitive slave law remained federal law until 1864, when it was finally canceled by Congress. But the attitudes that allowed it, the willingness to treat human beings as goods, the putting of property rights over human rights, the involvement of Northern institutions in Southern slavery, those attitudes lasted long after the law itself was gone. They persist in different forms to this day. Harold Grayson never fully recovered from knowing how his charity had been used. He spent the rest of his life supporting abolitionist causes, but always with the haunted awareness that good intentions weren't enough, that systems of oppression could use even genuine kindness. He died in 1871, his fortune largely spent on causes he hoped might fix his accidental involvement. Friedrich Vogel returned to Germany in 1867, carrying with him the memory of that August evening when simple food had caused such deep emotion. He never forgot the lesson that what we take for granted, seasoned meat, soft bread, dignity in eating, can be revolutionary acts for those who have been systematically denied their humanity. The camp at Wallabout Bay was eventually torn down, replaced by industrial development as Brooklyn grew into a major city. No marker exists today to show that formerly enslaved people once sheltered there, that they cried with joy over hamburgers, that they fought desperately for freedom that should never have been denied them. The land has forgotten if land can forget, but stories remember stories like this one, put together from pieces of records, from hints in diaries, from the silences in official histories where names should be but aren't. We tell these stories not because they have happy endings. Most don't, but because they reveal truths about who we were and perhaps who we still are. Patience Crane and her companions wanted something impossibly simple. To eat good food, to live without fear, to be treated as people deserving of dignity and respect, that such basic desires required a 7-month journey through hell, required risking death, required running from legal authorities who saw them as property rather than people. That tells us everything we need to know about the nation they were trying to survive in. They cried when they tasted those hamburgers because for one moment the world treated them as if they mattered, as if their pleasure, their satisfaction, their simple joy was worth something. And in that moment they were more free than they had ever been, even knowing, perhaps especially knowing, that the freedom might not last. That is the real horror of this story. Not the violence, not the kidnappings, not even the betrayal. The real horror is that a moment of genuine human kindness, the act of serving someone a warm meal, could be so rare, so unexpected, so overwhelming that it provoked tears. The real horror is that the system worked exactly as designed. That the law protected the abusers and condemned the victims, that Northern businessmen profited from Southern slavery while claiming moral superiority. The real horror is that these weren't monsters who did these things. They were ordinary Americans operating within legal systems, pursuing profit, following incentives that their society had established. That is what makes this story truly terrifying. Not the evil of individuals, but the evil of structures that turned ordinary people into participants in terrible acts. So, what do you think of this story? Do you believe everything that happened here has been left safely in history? Or do you see echoes of these patterns still operating today? Leave your comment below with your thoughts. If stories like this, the ones that reveal uncomfortable truths about American history, matter to you, then subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. These stories don't get told in textbooks. They don't get marked with statues or plaques. They survive only if we keep telling them, keep remembering, keep asking uncomfortable questions about how we got here and where we are going. Thank you for listening, and remember, the past isn't past. It is still with us, still shaping us, still demanding that we face its truths. See you in the next video.